Good morning and Merry Christmas. Today is the Lord's Day. Every Sunday is the Lord's Day. Why? Because that's the day that He was raised from the dead and gave us life eternal. But today is a very special Lord's Day because on it we get to celebrate His coming. What an amazing opportunity for us to worship Him today. And as we promised a very special broadcast this morning. It's 75 years ago today this story took place. It was at a time when America probably would have been gathered around their radio and turned to a radio program to listen to music or to a story on Christmas morning. So we want to do the same thing as we celebrate our church's 75th anniversary. On this day, they would have been listening to things about World War II as we had just entered into it. They would have been worried about Pearl Harbor. But some people stepped out and began to love and began to serve. So Dick Vo's going to tell us the story of the Cornhusker State of Nebraska, a little small insignificant town with some very normal everyday people who made a huge difference. Let's listen together.
Some years ago in Washington, D.C., when I lived there, a friend of mine, Wayne Tesh, came through town, and he loves a good story. And he said, "Foth, you need to read this book." And he gave me a book written by a Chicago sports writer, Bob Greene, entitled Once Upon a Town. Once Upon a Town is the story during the war years, the World War II years, of North Platte, Nebraska. North Platte, Nebraska, at that time, I think probably had 12,000 citizens. It was the hub for the Union Pacific Railroad. Today, there are no passenger trains that go through North Platte, but it is home to, I think, the largest freight yards in the world, called the Bailey Yards. Ray Wilson was a 26-year-old drugstore clerk in North Platte, and she had a brother who was in the National Guard for Nebraska, and she heard that a train was coming through 10 days after Pearl Harbor. First train coming through was on the 17th. And she heard that they were going to be Nebraska Guardsmen. She went down there to meet them, took some cookies, apparently, went down to meet them, and it turned out to be Kansans. She gave away the food with her girlfriends, however many were there, and that act stimulated an idea that hatched over the next 8 days. And on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1941, women, old and young, started meeting the troop trains that came through. And that started something. She went back, and in that next year, she organized women from North Platte and then from areas around to start meeting the trains. And of course, the schedule of trains picked up, and at the height of the war, anywhere between 18 and 30 trains a day would roll through North Platte, Nebraska at all hours of the day and night. And because of the women in that area, from 100 miles around, every train was met with food and grace and laughter and joy and kindness. A man who owned the lunchroom, sort of a defunct lunchroom there at the train station, was asked if he would volunteer that room, give that space, so that they could use it to make food. He did, and it became known as the North Platte Canteen, and it became an iconic stop in those war years for servicemen going east and west across the northern tier of the United States. The guys would jump off the train, run into this train station, because they only had 10 minutes. The Army had agreed that when they stopped for coal and water that the boys could get off, and they'd run into this train station canteen, and there they would find homemade ham and cheese sandwiches and homemade apple pie and pheasant sandwiches in season. I told the story at the Nebraska governor's breakfast some years ago, and a state senator came up afterwards and said, "My mom was there as a young woman working in that train station, and sometimes it was pheasant sandwiches out of season." Hot coffee, cold milk, a hug, piano playing, someone grabbing a girl and dancing with her across the canteen floor, and then the train whistle would sound and they'd have to run for the train. And as they sprinted out of the train station, going out of that door, Some young woman or older woman would hug a soldier and say, "God bless you, sailor. God bless you, soldier. We're praying for you." When Bob Greene was writing the book, he interviewed veterans, men who now were in their mid-80s, or maybe 90 even. And when he mentioned the name North Platte, Nebraska, oftentimes they would choke up and start to weep. And he'd say, "Why are you crying?" And they would tell a story something like this. Young man said, "I was brought up in the city in Brooklyn. Never been out of the city in my life. Graduated high school on a Friday morning. Went down and enlisted on Monday. And by Wednesday, I was on a train heading west. Sitting up for 2 or 3 days and nights, eating K rations, being there with all those other guys. And then in the middle of the night, we got the announcement, 10 minutes to North Platte. Had no idea what a North Platte was. We pulled up at this train station and everybody piled out and raced for this building. And when we ran in, there was all this food on tables, and there were women that looked like our moms and our aunts, and girls that looked like our sisters and our cousins. And we ate as fast as we could. We drank coffee, we ate pie, we ate a sandwich, whatever we could cram in our mouths. We did that, and then we'd run out, and then that's when someone would grab us and whisper in our ear and hug us and say, "God bless you, soldier. We're praying for you." And here we were, 18, 19 years old. We'd jump back on that train, going to God knows where, not knowing if we'd ever come back alive. But for 5 minutes, in the middle of a night, in a place we'd never been, with people we'd never met, someone was kind to us. And we never forgot it. And months later, guys would be pinned down under withering Japanese fire on an island somewhere in the South Pacific, crouched down in a foxhole just trying to survive. And a voice would come out of the dark saying, "Wouldn't it be great to be back in North Platte just for 5 minutes?" Or the same thing would happen with mortars raining down on them in a forest in France. But that moment in time, fixed in their minds as a place where kindness gave them hope. Years later, I told this story. This would have been back in the late 1990s. I told this story at a conference for youth workers in Denver, Colorado. The next morning, a young woman came up. I'll call her Jennifer. She said, I work in Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania. And when you were telling that story, I thought of my grandpa, who was in the Navy in World War II in the South Pacific. And I called my mom last night and said, "Mom, do you think Grandpa went through North Platte, Nebraska?" And she said, "Honey, I don't know, but why don't you call Grandpa? But you know how he is." She said, "My grandpa is in a nursing facility and he has dementia. A lot of times he doesn't know where he is and sometimes doesn't know who he is." But I called him last night. My grandpa's 90 years old. And I said, "Grandpa, does the name North Platte, Nebraska mean anything to you?" And instantly, he was lucid. And he said, "North Platte, Nebraska, you bet it does. That's the place where I ran in there for just a few minutes and they had cold milk and fresh donuts and they shined my shoes." I will never forget North Platte, Nebraska. What is it that can bring a 90-year-old man with dementia into reality in a nanosecond? 5 minutes of kindness in the middle of the night on my way to war, not knowing if I'll ever come back. When you meet someone who has a smile and a hug, and you've never met him before, but when you walk out, it feels like you've known him forever. I was speaking at a conference in Northern California, and I told this story. And in the afternoon, a couple of guys, different guys, independent of each other, came to me and said, "I went through North Platte, Nebraska." And that evening, when we met again, I had them come up on the platform. And one of them was named Buzz. He was from Yakima, Washington. The other was Lewis, and he was from Modesto, California. And I said, "You guys know each other?" They said, "No." "Never met?" "No." I said, "You know, you have something in common." I said, "What's that?" And I said, "Both of you went through North Platte, Nebraska and ran into that canteen for 10 minutes during the war." And they looked at each other and just reached out and grabbed each other and hugged. And the crowd went nuts. They were weeping and whistling and stomping and cheering because it signified a moment in American history when generosity overwhelmed fear. It signified a moment in American history where kindness, the light of kindness, pierced the darkness. We live in an affluent, sometimes narcissistic time when it's all about us and all about convenience and all about looking here, as opposed to how do I share in the sacrifice with these young men, many of whom will never come home. How can I be a part of that with what I have? And that's what makes the story iconic. FDR sent them a $5 bill or a $5 check. That was the extent of government money. And by today's standards, the amount of resources they poured into that effort, the people of that community, would be millions in today's dollars. And it came out of their pockets. You know, little girls would get up with their dads in the morning and go hunt eggs at 4 a.m. Because then chickens in the farmyard, they laid eggs wherever. You know, you'd go find them. And church groups and groups from synagogues and Girl Scout groups, and that they could do this thing together, not just to serve the nation, but to serve primarily young men, many of whom would pay the ultimate sacrifice. And none of them, neither the men nor the people who served, could ever be the same after that.
What an amazing story. Miraculous story of simple people choosing to love. Sort of like God coming to earth, choosing to be with us. He's God with skin on him. And these folks in North Plant were like God with skin on them. They loved people. 5 minutes of kindness changed people's lives. As you celebrate this day with your friends and your family, I want to encourage you to be that kind of person. Be that kind of giving and generous person. All generosity finds its source in Jesus. For God so loved the world that he gave. Friend, if you have never begun a relationship with Christ, you can do that today, right where you are. You can respond to Jesus. Invite him into your heart, for him to be the Lord of your life. Just like he came into the manger and came into Bethlehem, he will come into your heart, your mess, your unmentionables. He'll come there and be with you. Merry Christmas to you. Make a choice today to love God and love others in the way that he's commanded us to. From all of us here at Willamette, we just want to say we love you and Merry, Merry Christmas.